Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual program of the Commonwealth Club. My name is Mina Kim. I'm the evening news anchor at KQED and also the Friday host of KQED's program Forum. And I am so pleased to be moderating today's program called Divergent Minds Thriving in Adulthood, which is hosted by the Grown Ups Forum of the Commonwealth Club. And I am really excited to be able to talk with Janara Narenberg. I've been wanting to talk with her for so long about this book, Divergent Mind Thriving in a World That Wasn't Designed for You, which really you can feel her passion. It's palpable in the book in terms of her desire to really add to what she really sees as the relatively limited research that's been done on neurodivergence in women. Janara, she's a reporter for UC Berkeley Greater Good Science Center and for the Garrison Institute. She's founder of the Neurodiversity Project and now author. And our program will be about an hour. So if you would like to ask a question, there will be a Q&A period. I will also integrate questions in the latter half of our conversation. So please be sure to enter those questions in the YouTube chat area. And Janara Narenberg, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mina. I'm so happy to be here with you and also been really looking forward to it.
Yes, I know we were talking a little bit ago about how, book releases are so carefully timed and yours just happened to come out in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of really this country grappling with its history of racism and racial inequality. And I was just wondering, when you were talking about the right time to release this book, I mean, did it ever in your mind, did you ever think that this could be what you had to face?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question and obviously so memorable. And I think, in the neurodiversity community, we talk a lot about what it's like as a neurodivergent person on a daily basis, anyways, to kind of live differently, function differently, largely preferring solitude and stillness and reflection and things like that. So, in terms of daily life impact, it's been okay to manage. And with the recent sort of uprising and protests, it's a particular passion of mine, lifelong work and investment in that kind of solidarity. So that has been bringing out a different side, I would say, of me in terms of jumping in and looking at advocacy from my own family as well.
Well, I want to talk about you. And one of the things that I think was so powerful about you sharing the story of your awakening in terms of neurodiversity was just these personal experiences of seeing your symptoms, which were, as you said, labeled originally as anxiety. You had this moment when you discovered that they actually were considered autistic or ADHD. And I was wondering when that happened for you.
Yeah, this happened, it was about 4 years ago. I'm 36 now, so I was 32. I was a young parent. I had been a reporter abroad for many years, which suited my temperament well. We had recently been back in the U.S. and I found it just really difficult actually to integrate back. That was sort of like a first hardship, first challenge. And then seeing the amount of what I refer to as like task switching, the amount of having to go from, hyper focusing on a research article or an essay or an interview to the dishes and the laundry on top of just the amount of sensory input here. I found like the traffic lights and things like that. Um, and I honestly, I was on like Facebook and these articles started popping up in my feed about women being missed in certain research. And, I have a background in public health. I went to Harvard for grad school. So a few things just kind of started coming together for me in terms of what I was going through as an individual and then integrating some of my scientific and professional interests as a journalist.
And so, what you were talking about the transition back, I mean, what does that feeling of sensory overload? How does it present itself? What does it really feel like?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I mean, I would say everyone's different, right? For me, and I've had a lot of this since I was a kid, but I didn't quite know what to do with it. And I think this is a common story. First, I'll say I've always been prone to migraines actually and headaches. And I could never pinpoint where they were coming from. I've always been sensitive to light and sound. Um, Things like seeing violence on TV and things like that. And that was relatively common in my family actually, and we would talk about that kind of sensitivity. But which is common for other people. As I got older and the amount of sort of tasks that were required of me as an adult, just to function as a partner, as a parent, as someone who was working, it just kind of grows and grows and gets overwhelming, right? So you're asking like, what does it feel like? So for me, if I'm driving in my car, within like a few traffic lights, I will start to get like a little bit of like headache symptoms. That's one thing that happens for me. I often need to take breaks in conversations. I can't talk about anything too intense for too long. And then there's sort of the executive functioning side of these challenges, which is again, I do really well when I can hyper focus, which is, as a journalist, is really helpful, right? You just get really into a subject and you jump into these rabbit holes, and I love that. But when I have to sort of like divide up my time and do something, it's extremely difficult to go in and out of that place. Like, okay, 5 minutes. Oh, we need you for this. It's we call it like transition time or transition anxiety and that kind of thing. So I have all of that, and it might look different for me as an adult woman, and we talk about these things a lot in the context of children. So for adult women, it's just not as well known and understood, and that's part of where the book came from.
Yeah. I mean, why do you think it wasn't until you were in your early 30s and through your own process of self-discovery that you realized this, that it wasn't something that people realized when you were younger?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, so um, in the book, I get into the background, sort of like the history of mental health research and how women have been pathologized throughout history. So years ago, women were often labeled with hysteria, and I think anxiety is actually the modern equivalent of hysteria. I mean, everyone gets slapped with that label, right? And everyone gets prescribed, anti-anxiety meds or antidepressants. I mean, I think it's like 1 in 4 in the US. And I'm not sure what the breakdown is within that number in terms of men and women. So there are larger structural reasons, to begin with. And then for me in my own life as an individual, I think, like I said, sensitivity in general kind of runs in my family. So I don't know if like it wasn't really pathologized. I grew up in a really loving, open-minded family in San Francisco, and I guess who I was really embraced. And so, and because I did have this knack for like hyper focusing, and I was very curious, and so yeah, I think so. There's that, right? Like it wasn't totally picked up on it as like this clear thing. And I did have anxiety, and I had a lot of intensity, and I was very strongly affected by things. But again, I was just kind of accepted and embraced. Um, and then, when in my teens and 20s, though, I did have, I would say, gradually challenges built up, in the areas of depression and anxiety, like something that would look like kind of typical, I guess. Um, and then in college, when I started seeing a therapist more regularly to try to figure out why I was having certain reactions to things, again, all I heard was anxiety. And I think they're just doctors and therapists are not informed on a lot of this latest research. So these deeper layers of sensory challenges are not probed. I always refer to it as like an onion. If we peel away and we're just getting at, anxiety, depression, it's really kind of just staying on the outside, right? But on a deeper level, there's like sensory stuff, neurological differences. And also with this book, I really wanted to move away from the pathology paradigm and even like Freudian era thinking. And even, I mean, trauma research is really big right now, but it's not the whole picture. I mean, humans come into this world with differently wired nervous systems. So it's important to just kind of acknowledge that difference.
The other thing that I was really struck by was your description of masking, that you also tried really hard to blend in. What did that do? Like, how did that affect you?
Yeah, I think first of all, like I think many women who start to figure this stuff out later, it's kind of a hindsight thing. Like I think we don't consciously realize we're doing it, right? I think everyone in society to some extent has to put on certain hats, right, to function in different environments. But for some of us, that act takes on a much bigger role. I mean, not the act, but the this need to sort of perform to an extent in society that everyone does. But for some of us, it's more intense, right? So I think growing up, I always thought there was like a normal. Like that's how I thought. I just always thought that there was some kind of normal. I always felt outside of it. Again, I was often embraced for being kind of different. And so it was fun. I mean, I was really into theater um and so, but as I got older, especially I think like when you become a parent, when I became a parent, I felt like there's just like this role that you take on. And when you're around other parents and you feel like you need to be like kind of proper and conservative and just kind of like this way of like operating. Um, and so over time, what happened for me was just realizing the disconnect that I felt. I was like, I just do not relate to these people. And, just, and so, I think that's where that kind of loneliness can often come in. There's like a loneliness when you realize you're not really honoring yourself or your natural inclinations and the things that you might like to talk about. I talk about in the book, Divergent Mind, that I've always just been drawn to inner life and talking about sort of deeper subjects with people. And, in some context that's like kind of inappropriate. And, I don't relate to that. Like I'm kind of always ready to go to that place. So anyways, long story short, um, yeah, I think when that disconnect is there and when those layers of depression and anxiety start to build up, that's kind of when that huge wake up comes. And when you're like, okay, like I don't want this anymore. And it becomes important to look at like who you really are and just be yourself in the world.
I have to ask this audience question that's come in because it really is on point when you were talking about how you realized it when you became a mom as well, to some extent, that was a pretty eye opening experience for you. This question is: should parents of children or teens diagnosed with ADHD or autism be looking at their own history or symptoms? What
Yes.
would be most helpful for parents to know? Yeah.
Yes, 100%. That is a very good question. I get asked that a lot, and it's really common. In with almost everyone that I interviewed, actually the way that they figured out their own stuff was because their child got diagnosed first. Like that's just a very common pathway. So yeah, I would say, if you know your child has some kind of label, then it would be a good idea either to look at your own history or that of your family members. And I should also say, and I clearly talk about this in the book, that I did not pursue formal diagnosis. So I also don't think that anyone needs to have like a formal diagnosis. And that's for many reasons, right? We know that the system is very gender biased. And many times someone will walk into a clinic and they know so much more than the so-called expert. And so it's actually a really traumatizing experience. And in the neurodiversity community, it's pretty well acknowledged that for those of us like myself who do years and years of research on this stuff, we know our own selves better, than walking into a doctor's office. So I guess I would say that as well, that for many people, it's healing just to like have this information and kind of know how to work with it. And everyone can be, free to make their own decision. If they need that label, it can be really helpful and important in terms of requesting accommodations at school or at work. In my situation, I work from home and my family is very understanding about my sensory needs. So, that was enough for me.
Do you think there's a cost associated with learning this later, much later in life? Say once you become a parent.
Is there a cost? Like, I think that there are kind of pros and cons in a way. I think that for many people, it's in some ways it's freeing to not have a label growing up, right? Because you kind of move around in the world and learn things on your own and figure out how things work. That being said, for many people, they if this realization comes later in life, it usually come from some kind of crisis. So then I guess in hindsight, it's like, oh, could that crisis have been prevented? If they had this information sooner. So again, yeah, I think there's pros and cons either way.
I'd like to take a moment to just talk a little bit about sensitivity because I think it's something that we're frequently described as being, particularly women, I think, right? It's a label, it's a framing that has been put on us that one of the things that I really learned a lot about in your book was just how important it is to reframe our understanding of what sensitivity really is. Could you describe your relationship to sensitivity?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I was always a very sensitive kid, and I was always described as sensitive. Like that was the first thing that people would say about me, like kind of at the tip of people's tongues. Janara, like, oh yeah, she's so sensitive, and that like in every way, right? I was strongly affected by things. I was also a very deep feeler, right? So again, I was in theater. I became a writer. My favorite thing is interviewing folks and hearing their stories. So sensitivity is, a really wonderful trait in that way. Um, and I think in my life, sensitivity. Um, well, so are you asking about like just how it's informed my life, or
I think it's a couple things. One is that the realization that because it is something that we're often described as being, how do you know when you reach the point that it actually qualifies as neurodivergence?
right? Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, in the book, I talk about like 5 neurodivergences that have sensitivity in common. So, the first one is the trait of high sensitivity, which is the highly sensitive person, which is HSP for short. This is a term that Elaine Aron has coined back in the 90s. And it's just kind of a general umbrella trait describing like a personality trait of high sensitivity to sound, light, noise, feelings, not liking to rush around, things like that. um, and then I talk about autism and ADHD, and I talk about synesthesia, which is the crossing of the senses, and I focus on mirror touch synesthesia, which has been well documented, and is actually when a person uh, perceives somebody else's experiences or sensations as their own. Um, and then I talk about SPD, which is sensory processing disorder, which is not like officially in the DSM, but has been well researched, particularly by the STAR Institute in Colorado. And that is a little bit more about the physical manifestation of sensitivity, like sensitivity to certain materials and smells and textures, or it's also like very much about the body and having issues with organization and balance and things like that. So anyways, in the book, I look at these 5 traits because sensitivity features so prominently in all of these descriptions. And yeah, I think sensitivity is just this amazing thing, right, in our lives. And we neglect it. We think we have to get really tough and aggressive, and we just live in such a fast, hostile sort of daily environment, and I'm just like, why can't we flip that around? Like, isn't it the more sensitive of us who should be like leading this world, right? So, that's kind of the direction that the book goes in. But I wanted to lay the scientific foundation for this. So yeah, that's how I explored sensitivity.
And I really think that your objective of being able to recognize actually the power, the benefit of having neurodivergent traits really comes through, and how silly and damaging it can be to judge it, which is why you must have spent a lot of time thinking about the, the appropriateness of the term neurodivergent or divergent mind, just because of your sensitivity to language. Why did that word end up feeling right to you?
Neurodivergent, why did it feel, you mean as opposed to using the language of like disorder? Is that what?
Yeah, exactly. Like, why did that word seem to encompass what feels like your broader objective of it not being something that is judged as abnormal, as less than, or different in a more negative way? And thank you for asking, by the way, to
Oh,
clarify. I appreciate that.
yeah, totally. Yeah, I think, well, I think so. Neurodiversity is sort of like a framework, and it's a movement. It was first coined by sociologist Judy Singer in the 90s in Australia. And then it kind of, the idea spread amongst many different groups, that had been pathologized. And there's sort of a vocabulary. Nick Walker, who is local, he's an autistic scholar, and he really lays out these terms well. So we have neurodiversity is just sort of this acknowledgement of we all have different brain makeups, and it's a move away from pathologizing as normal and abnormal. And then neurodivergent would be the term that a person could use instead of saying, oh, I have this mental illness or I have this disorder. It would just be a way to kind of differentiate, and it's more empowering, right? It's affirming. And then we have other terms, right? Again, instead of saying something like illness or disorder, we would say, what is the neurodivergence? And then, of course, we have the term neurotypical, which just kind of describes someone who would identify as, without neurodivergence. So I found this language and this framing incredibly powerful. And I found that it really aligned with my own philosophy and thinking. In fact, I had been on my own thinking about a framework like this, and I was using I was using this phrase, like temperament rights, like, someone's access or sort of like uh, what they could request in the name of their own temperament differences. And then I started, Googling around to see if anyone else was kind of talking about this. And that's when I stumbled on the term neurodiversity, and I found Steve Silberman's work, and I found Nick Walker's work. And that's kind of how it all happened. But again, I think it also goes back to just how I grew up, like growing up in a really like accepting family and an accepting sort of school environment. I went to SOTA, which is School of the Arts in San Francisco. So I have a lot of pride about growing up in the city with so many different kinds of kids. And so I just found that neurodiversity matched my own sort of values. And the last thing I'll say on this is actually that, in a lot of other cultures, having any kind of mental difference is often seen as a gift, actually. So that was very powerful for me as well. And that really resonated and was also part of my journey, actually. And, really just seeing the difference in how we frame difference.
And how do you think we're doing in terms of language? Are we getting better at using language that does do that, that does treat uh, neurodiversity or divergent minds as gifts?
You mean like how are we doing in the US or?
Yeah, so in society wise, like how are we doing in terms of our progress towards that? Do you think That are you seeing significant progress, or do you feel like we still have a long way to go?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, I mean, there has been a lot of effort, I would say, especially, here in the Bay Area, like in the tech community and all the big companies here. A lot of them have, these neurodiversity working groups and things like that. Um, but I mean, that's just like such a small drop, of course, and a lot of those initiatives, I would say, have um, been utilized by men who are white, where these things are very recognizable. So I think there's a lot of people of color, a lot of women whose experiences are still going under the radar, not being acknowledged, or they don't feel comfortable talking about these things because it might be a little bit more hidden, a little bit more invisible. Like we use this term, invisible disabilities. Um, so I think it's just like there's pockets where efforts are being made. Um, I think that with, sort of like our millennial generation and social media, and even the way a lot of pop culture stars are really open about their own like mental health diagnoses, I would say, particularly with something like bipolar or depression, we're hearing lots of people opening up about these things, from Kanye West to Selena Gomez. Um, a while back, Catherine Zeta Jones opened up about her bipolar. So yeah, I would say that we still have a long way to go. I'm happy that efforts are being made. But I think I'm interested in sort of the deeper narratives that we hold as a society, in terms of how we think about difference to begin with, and yeah, and really challenging sort of like social norms that we think are just normal, right?
Yes, that thread is really clear throughout your work, and I definitely want to talk a little bit later about one of your new projects, the Interracial Project, which again, this thread I think runs through very deeply. I did want to get back to an audience question, which was wondering if you had thoughts about how to handle when you are feeling out of sync with your environment, dorm, roommates, family feels too loud and chaotic, when you're prone to headaches and anxiety. And it's a great question because there is a whole section in your book that really does talk about techniques that you can use when you are feeling this out of sync way. So, what are your thoughts for this person?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I mean, there's different things, and again, it's going to be different for every person. So, I mean, a really easy thing that you can do on your own is just like getting outside actually and taking like a little walk, for 5 to 10 minutes. That can really help regulate your nervous system. Of course, there's like the fresh air, there's greenery, things like that. So that's just like a great go-to place. So if you notice that you're starting to experience overwhelm, that the more you can kind of train yourself like that's a cue, then the earlier you're going to kind of catch that experience, right? It's also important to communicate to the people around you, so that people understand what you're going through. I mean, probably 10 times a day in my own house I have to ask my family members to turn down the volume of music, and they know that, and um, so having your needs understood and accepted and respected is really important. um, I recommend, if it's possible, something like occupational therapy, which is really interesting. I was a gymnast as a kid, and I talk about in the book when I walked into an occupational therapy clinic for the first time, where they mostly see kids, right? They don't often see adults. Um, and I was just like, oh, this makes sense for me, because you walk in and there's these gym mats all over and these like interesting swings and fabrics hanging from everywhere. Um, but something like that, even just like 2 sessions, is really helpful because they your clinician will help you understand what your body is seeking and craving, in those moments of overwhelm, and how to kind of get back to center. So I recommend that. And then there's, more straightforward things that some people rely on, like noise canceling headphones and things like that. And the book gets into sort of a few other suggestions.
Can I ask you about a suggestion that I was really struck by when I read it? And it was don't feel guilty when you start to feel better. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, thanks for noticing that. Well, I think that for many of us who go through this journey, right? In the beginning, there is often this just like huge awakening, right? And we kind of jump into this and we're really into it and we're like, oh my gosh, and like what happened? And there's some amount of anger, in the beginning. And especially if you do really get into this whole framework and this movement kind of, you know, um,
You mean
so
anger at, forgive me, anger at not knowing, not having given it a name, do you mean, or not knowing sooner? Or,
I think like just that 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 you could go so long in your own life with like like no experts like helping you, or and like not pointing this out, and like especially if you've tried many things. I think that's very frustrating. So there's anger about that. And then there's the anger of just like, oh wow, like yeah, society doesn't really handle mental differences that well, and we have a long way to go. So there's that kind of anger, there's that movement, the passion. um, and then, you know, as you get deeper into this and you kind of start to revise things in your life, it gets more integrated, right? So then you just find ways to kind of manage your days differently, and your family starts to figure it out, your friends start to accommodate you in different ways. And so, okay, like there's change in my life and things like that. And then, hopefully, ideally, if you're able to kind of pivot, you do start to feel better, right? You're like, okay, I have this information, I understand, it's a whole new lens. Oh, I'm doing well and I'm happy, right? And so what I meant when I said that was that really, like, um, it's okay if there's less of that like fight, because in the beginning it feels like a fight because you feel like, oh my gosh, like what I was just detailing, like just that there's this kind of like fight against the system, and why did this happen, and how come I didn't know this sooner, and that kind of thing. So um, I think what I also said in that list where that quote appears is that we want to integrate all of these realizations, right? And then when we start to feel good, like it's really important to share that with the world. It's really important to share that we can be different and function differently and still be joyful creatures and be happy, right? Like it's not just because it's not some kind of doom situation, right? Like you find out something and things are never going to work out. Does that make sense? It's like
so if I'm understanding you correctly, I think you're saying that there's a guilt associated with if you're not fighting, that maybe you're giving up the fight to some extent, or you're somehow stepped back a little bit. Is that what you meant when?
yeah, or yeah, something like that. Yeah, just, or it's really actually just like giving you permission in a way, because like again there's a whole like neurodiversity movement that a lot of people kind of jump into, like pushing for change and things like that. And so I think that for a person's like sort of journey of growth, like you see this with college students, right, who get really into like an aspect of their identity and stuff like that. And then as they get older, it kind of just changes. They're just more sure, they're self-assured in who they are. I think that's what I'm getting at. And then so it's like it's good for people to see neurodivergent people just out in the world like as they are. And yeah.
I see. Well, this person wants to know why did you leave out males? I'm a neurodivergent male and believe that at least 40 to 50% of neurodivergents are males. Did you leave out males, Janara?
Um, well, the focus of this book is definitely on women. I wanted to center women's narratives because women have been really neglected in the research, and very poorly misunderstood. And that's why we're seeing so many women being late diagnosed as autistic or ADHD. They're often referred to as like the lost generation of women because these things were not properly recognized. And in, depression, shame, low self-esteem just kind of took over. And so there's been a lot of other work on men. So for me, it was, very important to center women's narratives for this book.
It was kind of what I was getting at when I had asked the question earlier about if you feel like there was a cost associated with women not knowing
Mhm.
because of this concept of the lost generation that you bring up. I mean, what are some of the losses?
Yeah, I think, it's so sad to think about the number of women out there in the world, who are really struggling and who um, don't have the information available to them. They don't have these other lenses, right? They just think like, oh God, like something's wrong with me, or, I can't do this and that, or why am I always getting this kind of feedback at work or in my relationships or with my friends, or, questioning self-doubt, like, oh, is this normal? And things like that. And so, that is definitely a loss. Like, I don't want, neurodivergent women out there to be going through that. And so, yeah, so I would say yes, for as long as those kinds of narratives are persisting in women's minds, and yes, that is a loss and that's a cost. Um, of course, when they do get access to this information and kind of have these kind of wake ups, like, it's just amazing. And I get emails all the time, today, yesterday. It's just so amazing to hear from people when they either when they find my book or they're just interested in these topics, that what a huge aha moment it is and what a huge wake up it is for them, to have an entirely different conception of who they are, why their life has been the way it's been, the different direction that they want to go in moving forward. Yeah, so.
Yes, I think it speaks to just also when you're fully able to embrace who you are and be out there in the world, as you were saying, also what you contribute to the world, which is something that you emphasize as well, and how people understanding how to make space for people who are neurodivergent also improves everybody's lives to some extent. I do, though, want to get to this question of somebody who writes, "Sorry, but what exactly is neurodivergent?" So maybe we can spend a little time just defining it some more.
Yeah. So again, with this kind of like new vocabulary, new terminology, neurodiversity is this term that just refers to acknowledging that all humans have different brain makeups, mental makeups. It's often compared to something like biodiversity, right? That this is very important for us as a human species. So neurodivergent really is just a term that we would use for anyone who kind of diverges from what we think of as the norm in our society, or what is kind of standard expected of an adult, in terms of what they can do, what they can manage, what their abilities are. So it's an all-encompassing term. It does not just mean autism. It's very commonly used in the autistic community, but it really applies to, like I said, bipolar, OCD, uh, um, autism, ADHD, dyslexia. Dyslexia is another community where neurodiversity is talked about a lot. So yeah, that's what neurodivergent means.
And I really, going back to the question from the person who asked about males and leaving out males, one of the things that it makes me think of is also the benefits broadly, as you say, of exploring what it means in terms of how this presents in women and what can be done when we understand um, such a large proportion of our population. is probably to some degree neurodivergent. Could you talk a little bit about contributions that you've seen as we've understood this and made space for it in terms of either design or even informing our health system, things like that?
Sure. So yeah, one of the interviews that I did in the book was with Sarah Seeger, who is a professor at MIT, um, who was actually not formally diagnosed at first, and I think she did seek it out eventually. But it was like her professor's wife who was like, "Oh, like, yes, you for sure like have Asperger's, like you're on the autistic spectrum." And she was like, "Huh, oh really?" And then she kind of looked back and was like, "Oh yeah, like that makes sense." And so she's recently written more about it. And so she, she's a MacArthur Genius Grant and winner, and for her, she said what she told me in the book, she always felt drawn to like looking at the stars and just being drawn to space and thinking about it, and that really suited her. And so she's having a huge impact, within her area of research, searching for exoplanets. And that's obviously like like one like amazing example. I would say my friend Margot Joff, who's featured in the book, who I've gotten to know recently through this research. She she was identified with ADHD at 29, and she started Yahoo's first employee resources group for neurodiversity. She's now with Verizon, but when she started this group at her office, um, I think she said like she like ended up speaking to like 8,000 people or something about this, and slowly, like one by one, all these really senior people started coming out about having ADHD and having OCD. And so, it's just so amazing to see like one person take that first step, right? And opening up about who they are in their inner life. And it's so freeing to let other people do the same, right? Then we all just feel more real and more relaxed with one another. So obviously, like she's had a huge impact. And then in terms of looking at like history, again, this is better documented when it comes to men. But some even think that someone like Le Corbusier, who's a world-renowned architect and designer, some have speculated that he might be on the autism spectrum. He had a really strong preference for very minimalist design, and some would say that that's kind of in line with like the autistic sensibility. Um, and there's several other figures, of course. Temple Grandin is a very well-known person. Steve Silverman, who wrote Neurotribes, detailed a couple of other historical figures. Even someone like Albert Einstein is thought to have had ADHD. So, we know that people who think differently can do really well when they are just like kind of given the freedom to do so, right? It becomes really tricky when these different thinkers are sort of expected to adhere to some kind of social norm with their working space and things like that. So yeah, and that's something that I talk about a lot in the book, is just the importance of respecting that people work differently, and then they can really be innovative and get really creative.
Well, this viewer asks, can you say something about shame and neurodivergence?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you for asking that. Shame. Shame is such a big issue. I think shame is one of those things that it's kind of twofold, right? Like shame often is what will lead someone to try to figure out more, right? Like they can't figure out like, oh, like what's going on with me. Let's say like before they figure out, that they are neurodivergent and what's really going on. These feelings of depression or low self-esteem can kind of propel someone to figure out like, where is this coming from? So that's like one aspect of it. Now, if it's somebody who is aware of their neurodivergence already and maybe experiencing shame as a result, or maybe they've been made to feel shame from how other people are treating them, um, it is so important to find people who can be supportive, who can be accepting. There was a study that came out a couple years ago showing that acceptance from oneself and from society has such a big impact on reducing anxiety and depression. And so, as sensitive individuals, we do need to think carefully about who we are choosing to spend time with. Who our colleagues are, who we are giving energy to in our friendships and that kind of thing. Um, so, and I think it is important to reach out and even find people like yourself. That was a big part of my process when I was first getting curious about all this. I just actually just put up a Facebook event, and it was like a neurodiversity gathering. It was like 30 people showed up, and we just from all different backgrounds, and we just had this kind of conversation about what it was like to kind of be different in the world. And that initiative grew and became the Neurodiversity Project, where we have speakers and authors come in. But that being able to connect and be open with people removes that layer of shame. It just kind of removes the pathology of it. You feel normal in a sense, right? Because you're around people who are like you. So yeah, community can be very healing.
When you talk about growing up, I can feel a lot of affection for having grown up in San Francisco. I wonder what role you feel like growing up in San Francisco has played in your ability to be on your journey, to
Yes.
embrace where you're at.
Mina, you're gonna make me cry. I'm serious. Just when gosh, Mina is a really good interview. When you did your interview with Joe Talbot and Jimmy Fails about the last Black man in San Francisco, I was so struck by it because they're San Francisco natives, and the way they describe their experience and their affection for San Francisco and what it used to be, really resonated. And I was literally like weeping in my car, because I think I hadn't heard many other people talk about it in so long. It was kind of like revisiting childhood. But yes, San Francisco was a very magical place to grow up in. I would say, this is like the 90s. It was so accepting. I went to public schools. We lived, in the heart of the city. My neighbors, upstairs, downstairs, and in the back were from all walks of life. And I've written about this before. I've written essays on it. But to be immersed in a setting where people are so different. My downstairs neighbor was a Black circus artist, and he would be like juggling in the side yard. And there was a hairdresser in the back, and my neighbors were an interracial gay couple. I took Muni to school every day. I would run into the school secretary. She was Black. She was very protective of my sister and I. And that, we would be on the bus out into the sunset, out in the outer avenues where our classmates were, I think our school was like 70% Asian American. So it was just like this daily flow of just like difference. And then that was normal to me, right? Like that was normal. And I didn't realize how different that was, like, for most people. But yeah, I think that was just extremely formative, and made me feel just free, made me feel really free, and so I think, yeah, as I got older and seeing that, most of the world was not like that, and that there were certain ways that I was somehow supposed to try to be or something like that, that became very painful. So yeah, that's what you're sensing and picking up on. Yes, I have a huge affection.
In that sense of freedom, I mean, it makes me think back to the earlier question we got from the audience member that was asking about children and teens diagnosed, and also asked what would be most helpful for parents to know. I mean, it sounds like one of the key ways to, I don't know, parent or is to create an environment where your kids really truly feel free to be who they are and celebrate difference. I mean, are there things that parents can do to create that? I imagine it's also sort of challenging in this environment too when we're kind of confined to our homes more.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think definitely at home, it's incredibly important to um, really nurture like what what the a kid's sort of inclinations seem to be, right, in terms of what their maybe what their special interests are, or or and just having a lot of fun together. I think like that's so important. But I mean, I do think like a school community plays a big role, right? Because that is where the kid is going to be every day picking up on cues and getting sort of that feedback loop about what is okay or what's valued and that kind of thing. So um, as much as possible, where a school community can be open and supportive, and also diverse too in terms of like their viewpoints and how they um, encourage diversity of thought. I think that's really important. Um, yeah, and my book and my research really focuses on adults, which is interesting because we do have a lot of literature on kids, and what I'm hearing from my readers is that it is so helpful because it's giving parents a sort of like a look into the future, like a glimpse, about how they can better guide their kids, and especially if they're teenagers, sort of that transition to adulthood. Um, so yeah, it's definitely,
Hmm.
yeah,
It's a
heartwarming.
really interesting point. Um, this person asks, you mentioned that diagnosis is not always necessary. What do you mean by that, especially asking regarding kids and teens?
Yeah, well, I think um, again, it really depends, right, on like the situation. So I've heard from some parents where, they might sense some things in their kids, like something's different. Maybe they've chatted with a teacher about it, or maybe even a doctor. But if they feel like they can work with it, they can support the kid. They don't necessarily feel like their kid would benefit from like sort of like special tailored services or accommodations. Then I have heard from parents just kind of leaving it at that, like just watching, and to me, I mean, that makes sense, right? Like we have to stop and think about what diagnosis even means, right? And I talked about this in the book that these really are human, like man-made categories, right? We have, well, our it's not us. I mean, we've inherited what sort of doctors and researchers in the past have decided to categorize and kind of lump together. Okay, symptoms need to be in this column, and this one needs to be in that one. But they're not necessarily like these static things, right? And that's why you also see lots of kids and adults with multiple diagnoses or changing diagnoses. So it's just kind of it's good to keep that in mind. So yeah, so I think it just depends on the individual and what they really need. Again, if it's an adult who needs to request accommodations at university, like that makes perfect sense, or for a kid in their classroom, yeah, totally makes sense. And then there are just some other situations where um, it might just not be really urgent. So that's really what I mean when I say that.
Well, this person writes, how do you address the tension between wanting to honor neurodiversity versus some people needing accommodations for autism in the workplace or educational settings? I don't know
Yeah,
if you can.
Yeah, and I talk about that a lot in the book as well. And my approach is to really honor all perspectives. Like, I don't think there's like one right way to do it. I think it totally depends on the individual. And I think that they're, part of the neurodiversity movement, or even something like the Mad Pride movement, is like affirming, like, yes, I have this, and I feel a lot of pride about it. So I don't really think that there needs to be that tension. I think that people use different terms. People, some people refer to whatever they have as a difference or a disability or a disorder. And I don't necessarily think there's like one right way. I think it's just whatever is right for that person, or for that family and for that particular context. So I think it's important for each person to be on their own journey, though, and sort of have some agency in it, and to check in with themselves about what feels right. So yeah.
Well, we just have a few minutes left, and I do want you to tell us about the interracial project, this next project that you're working on.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited about it. Yeah, so the interracial project is something that kind of emerged over a period of time, and your questions earlier kind of help tell the story. Just my own family is interracial. Well, in my own case, my husband is from Nepal, and we're raising our biracial child, and we've spent a lot of time in both countries. My stepmom is Iranian. My brother's wife is from Japan. We have members in our family from Mexico. So again, like this was kind of a norm for me growing up, and so I just been reflecting recently over the period of months, like how uh, this this narrative is not really seen in the public sphere very much, right? I mean, we talk about race a lot, right, as a society, but we haven't really gotten to a place where we um, are comfortable with the intimate details of it, right? So interracial families, interracial couples, sharing our daily lives together, doing laundry, taking trips, things like that. And so, yeah, so I reached out to some other writers and creatives. And so we're on Instagram at Interracial Project. And actually, tomorrow at 1 p.m., we go live. I'm interviewing Roxane Gay and her partner, Debbie Millman. And so the idea is to kind of just put interracial life and family and friendship and love more at the center. And we'll have different hosts and collaborators. I have one friend near Minneapolis. He's a Black father. He's raising two biracial children, and he'll be running a series of interviews with young adults and how they straddle their biracial identity. And yeah, we want more people to get involved and follow us there on Instagram. And we'll see just like how it grows. But I think people can see how a lot of these themes fit together, and just kind of telling new stories, telling different stories, and reframing narratives, and how we think, how we talk about these topics in pop culture. So yeah, that's the Interracial Project.
Yeah, and if you had to think about or characterize what your ultimate goal is, because so much of my sense of you, Janara, is that you're on a quest, to some extent, And so the way all of these things to come together, what would be your ultimate vision?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think I, I'm very interested in getting to like the deeper heart of things. And as someone who is a member of the media, as a journalist, I'm just so interested in language and the words that we use to frame our conceptions of ourselves and of each other. And I think that media narrative stories are so powerful, right? In helping us all like shift gears, right? So I think that's sort of the overarching umbrella is like, how do we do that? How do we reframe narratives so that everyone feels, freer and more loving and more connected in this world? I think that's definitely an overarching narrative. And with these two projects, with the Neurodiversity Project and the Interracial Project, I'd love to see them both grow even more. Definitely more books coming up. I'd like to also get into, probably some documentary and film and media, just so that these issues are even more front and center for people in different mediums. That's really important to me. Yeah.
So then let our viewers know how they can contact you and where they can get your book.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, you can find me on, Facebook, Instagram, Neurodiversity Project, Interracial Project. My website is divergentlit.com. Feel free to reach out to me. And you can find the book everywhere. If you go to bookshop.org, they're great because they support independent booksellers. Here in the Bay Area, it's sold at Copperfield's, Books Inc., Book Passage, and a bunch of other places. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, congratulations, Janara, on the book. And yes, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Janara, for speaking with us. And that concludes our virtual program at the Commonwealth Club. Thank you for watching. I'm Mina Kim.